Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest is Yevgeniya Gaber. She's a senior research fellow at the Atlantic Council, and she is based in Odesa, in a Ukrainian city on the northern shore of the Black Sea, which Russia bombs in days every night after the grain deal was not prolonged. Thank you, Yevgeniya, that you have found time amid this Russian bomb terror for this interview.
Thank you, Sergey, for the invitation, and don't be surprised if I have to proceed to shelters while our talk, because it happens a lot these days.
Yes, I know it, and thank you that you found time amid this terrible situation. But before we start, could you please shortly elaborate what is the situation now? What was the grain deal about, which was not prolonged? Why Russia shells Ukraine? What is the situation? What is the situation in the harbor of Odesa on the Black Sea overall?
Well, the initial idea behind the grain deal, when it was inked back in July, August last year, was to partially unblock the seaports, Ukrainian seaports in the southern part of Ukraine, and to give a possibility to export Ukrainian agricultural products and Ukrainian grain, because this is crucial for African countries, Middle East, for the global South, and generally for the global markets. And it directly influences the global prices, obviously, on the agricultural markets. For these almost 12 months, the grain has been functioning with different level of efficiency. I would say it was quite efficient in the first months of its existence, but then afterwards, the Russian side started to obstruct the whole process and actually to block the process from inside, being a part of this deal, to stop issuing permissions for the vessels to come to Ukrainian ports and to leave them. So what happened now in July this year is only official announcement by the Russian side that the grain deal is no more functional and that it quits the deal. Because if we go back, and we can elaborate on that later, if we go back to previous period, it was obvious already in May and June this year that this grain deal is not going to be functional, because Russia was threatening it every time and blackmailing and talking about the possibility of withdrawing from the grain deal.
So, to make it clear and understandable for everyone who is watching this podcast, we are now like at the end of July 2023, and we have the situation in the Black Sea when the sea waters are heavily mined, also with the sea mines which have lost their anchors and are chaotically moving in the water. We have also the ongoing situation with the Russian Navy vessels, which are on their way on the Black Sea. And we have heavily bombardments of the Ukrainian seaports and since the last several days of the grain terminals with the Russian cruise missiles. Have I missed something?
Well, actually, you're totally right, because what was thought as a humanitarian initiative, these grain corridors to export Ukrainian grain, it turned into a possibility, a leverage for Russia to blackmail the whole world, and basically turned into a veto right for Russia to say which vessels can come into the Black Sea Basin and which cannot. And we're talking about the occupation of the Black Sea Basin. That's also important to understand. This war, it has not only the part with occupation of large swaths of Ukrainian territory on land, but also blockade and occupation of the Sea of Azov, firstly, and then large parts of the Black Sea region, of the Black Sea Basin. So what we have now, as you mentioned, on the one hand, we have a global food crisis on the horizon, because in case Russia does not get back to the negotiation table and then block the whole process, we will have again to face the increasing prices and then the threat of famine in the African countries, destabilization, refugee crisis, and so on. But on the other hand, we have Russia destroying Ukrainian agricultural sector and Russia destroying Ukrainian seaport infrastructure, because this is all happening all at the same time. setting Ukrainian fields on fire, killing, assassinating leading names in Ukrainian agricultural sector, farmers, directors of enterprises, etc. Shelling and bombarding the seaport infrastructure and also offices of the major companies which are based in Ukraine and which are engaged in the grain trade and trade and agricultural products. So physically, it's now impossible to export grain, but at the same time, it's also about insurance, because no company would obviously want to send its ships to the Black Sea. When you have this situation, the insurance costs are skyrocketing, and this all makes it impossible for Ukraine to export its grain. And at the same time, Russia is destroying grain terminals, silos, everything where the crops from the previous year are now stored, and then we have new crops from July, August, and we'll have more of that. So that's another major problem for Ukrainian economy, apart from Ukrainian security.
So to make it very clear, you have described it perfectly, but I really want to stress it that the sea route between the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv, the Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea, in the northern western part of the Black Sea, the sea route between these two ports and the strait, the Bosporus Strait, which leads further to the Mediterranean, it goes through zone and territorial zone of Ukraine, of Bulgaria, Romania, and then Turkey. It does not affect any way international waters of the Black Sea, as the vessels, they go in territorial waters, and it does not affect any waters that Russia even claims, like around of Crimea. Of course, Crimea is Ukrainian sovereign territory, but even according to the Russians' claims, the vessels go in the territorial waters of sovereign countries, and still the Russians don't let these vessels to go.
Exactly. So I think in Ukraine there is this expectation for more appetite, more ambitions, and more leadership from the NATO countries, which are Black Sea littoral states, which you mentioned, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. Because this is how Russia is getting a dominant position in the Black Sea region, violating not only the basic principles of the international law, which Russia is generally doing, but also violating the right of these countries, of the NATO members, for having a free hand in free commercial navigation in the Black Sea. And I think one of the major expectations in Ukraine now, apart from, of course, stepping up efforts to boost Ukrainian defense capacities and capabilities, air defense, anti-missile defense, coastal defense. This is all important just to have this shield and to cover from the air the possible export routes, but also that these countries will take care of the safety and security of the critical infrastructure in the Black Sea, because we have pipelines in the Black Sea. We have very high probability and possibility of false flag operations, provocations, floating mines. We have gas reserves here in this part of the Black Sea as well, especially in the northern part. So there is a huge, it's a larger situation which is not confined to the grain corridors. It's about how Russia is trying to control the Black Sea as such. And that's why when we have Baltic Sea, which has already become a NATO lake, we'd obviously like, if not turning of the Black Sea into the NATO lake, but at least not letting the Black Sea to turn into the Russian lake. That's for sure.
Yeah, that is exactly the danger that we are all facing when Russia can dictate the rules, how free nations, including several NATO countries, how we let the cargo vessels move in our territorial waters. Then we provide Russia with enormous leverage. And we all heard the interview by Margarita Simonyan, the head of the Russian main propaganda agency RT, who said that Russia sets on the world hunger. She literally said that Russia's only hope is world hunger, and that is what Russia is trying to do. But coming to a more broad perspective on the situation in the Black Sea, how strong is the Russia's control over the Black Sea because we know that Russia has installed since years coastal missiles, anti-naval missiles on occupied Crimea. Russia has certain Black Fleet, but can we say that Russia is empowered to control the Black Sea when the NATO countries really oppose these Russia's claims?
I think mentally, yes, because it's very much about perceptions, not physically, not in terms of military capacity, and not in terms of Russian Navy, especially after the liberation of the Snake Island, and especially after Moscow ship is no longer with us. I would say that Russia does not have a chance to control, especially this part of the northwestern part of the Black Sea Basin, with what it has now. But of course, there are so many different fears, risk assessments, misperceptions, misconceptions of the so-called Russian red lines. There is a lot of talk and fuss around the possible escalation on the Black Sea, etc., etc. So by these attacks, not in terms of sea warfare, but in terms of threatening, blackmailing, escalation for de-escalation, but with better terms for Russia. That is how the Kremlin is generally trying to impose its rules and arrangements in the Black Sea. So obviously what the Ukrainian side is talking about, that we need much more of NATO presence in the Black Sea, with convoys, possible convoys for the ships, which can pass through the territorial waters of these countries, not of the non-literal NATO members, because obviously we have the Montreux Convention, and we have very strong position of the Turkish side, which closed the Bosphorus and the Straits for non-Black Sea member states warships. But at least with those countries that we have in the Black Sea, I think we do need more decisive policy, more visionary policy and stance of NATO as alliance. And finally, we need NATO to recognize that it's not, the Black Sea is not outside of NATO. We have Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey, meaning that NATO has its territorial waters in the Black Sea, and it has to step up its efforts to deter Russia on sea and not to be afraid of these so-called red lines, escalation, etc.
The balance of powers in the Black Sea and how much NATO do we need to return the rule of law on the international waters? That's what we will talk later. But before we do this, don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share, and to write your comments in the commentary section. Yevgeniya, tell us, we have, like you have already mentioned, that NATO has de facto power to challenge Russia on the Black Sea, but until now it hasn't happened. So if we will witness the Russian attacks on the cargo vessels going from Odesa and Mykolaiv to the Sea of Bosphorus, we have already heard the statements by the Turkish President Erdogan on the Turkish role in securing the safe passage of the vessels. Can we really expect that Turkey can challenge Russia on the Black Sea militarily?
Well, no and no. My first no goes to the possibility of Russia actually attacking ships on the Black Sea. This generally might happen, but I don't think that the probability is really high. For Russia, it's a much more, let's say it's a safer strategy to attack Ukrainian seaport infrastructure, because it's in war with Ukraine, and that's how it distracts Ukrainian economy, it destroys Ukrainian economy, and it doesn't risk to go into direct confrontation with a NATO member. What can happen or might happen on the Black Sea may be kind of a provocation, false flag operation, etc., but it's difficult for me to imagine the situation when Russia is specifically targeting, let's say, Turkish vessel, which is either in this military convoy or bringing grain outside of Ukraine or going toward the Ukrainian seaports. If this happens, because never say never, my second no goes to the possibility of direct confrontation between Turkey and Russia. And that's what we hear now from the Turkish side as well, that the efforts of the Turkish side will be focused mostly on the diplomatic and political dialogue, diplomatic efforts to bring Russia back to the negotiations table. Just yesterday, Turkish Foreign Ministry Hakan Fidan said that the only option that Turkey is now mainly working on is getting Russia back to the negotiations table, because they regard all other options as those which can threaten the security and stability in the region. So I believe there will be a lot of backtrack diplomacy, a lot of meetings, conversations. Putin's visit to Turkey is expected in August, and I believe that President Erdogan will use all different leverages he has, from diplomatic experience, political clout, geopolitical leverages to economic incentives to persuade Putin to get back to the grain deal.
Can other NATO nations which have their Black Sea coast, like Romania and Bulgaria, can they challenge Russia, or will they try to either stay neutral?
You know, it's not about challenging Russia. Actually, the whole mindset that any attempt to deter Russia, which is challenging the world, is challenging Russia, that's very tricky, because self-defense is not escalation. Defending what you have and defending international law is not about challenging or provoking. It's just about showing Russia that it's just a normal state like any other that has to abide by the rules and by the principles of the international law. But again, I don't see this readiness or will to challenge Russia's dominance in the Black Sea now, at least in this naval military terms. Ukraine, by the way, is probably the only country now which said that it was ready to challenge Russia, saying that, okay, if you say in Russia that you see any vessel going to Ukrainian ports as a so-called legitimate target for your military, then for us it goes the same way, and then we can regard any vessel going to the Russian ports also as a target for Ukrainian military. Ukrainian Navy is not that strong, obviously. We don't have this capacity, but we have unmanned platforms. We have different types of drones. We have different types of missiles, which have been used quite successfully in different situations so far. So I think this is what deters Russia from actually being involved and engaged in this naval confrontation in the northern western part of the Black Sea. But again, Russia still has a dominance in the air, and Ukraine cannot cope with this with its own capacity. So that's why, again, air defense, coastal defense, F-16s, and everything Ukraine needs to win this war, actually. It's crucial not only for Ukraine, not only for NATO in the Black Sea, but generally for global food security, for global humanitarian security, and also, of course, for Africa and for the global South.
Yeah, of course, Yevgeniya, I'm sorry for my wording. When I said challenging, I meant like bringing Russia to some reason and drawing some real red lines that Russia should not cross, like, for example, attacking cargo vessels with grain heading from Odesa and Mykolaiv southwards. But you have already mentioned the statement by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, when the Ministry of Defense said that Russian cargo vessels heading, or other cargo vessels heading to the Russian ports and Russia-occupied ports can be seen as military targets and can be attacked. You have already elaborated a bit on that, but may I ask you if this threat was just a political statement demonstrating Russia that any attack on Ukrainian cargo vessels will lead to retaliation, or can we really imagine that Ukraine may try to cut the cargo lines to the Russian ports and Russia-occupied ports on the Black Sea?
Well, obviously, this is just a mirror answer to the Russian statement on attacking a possibility or kind of legitimacy to attack vessels going to Ukraine. I think that during this month of war of aggression against Ukraine, the official Kiev has proved that it does not attack civilians, it does not attack any target which risks the lives of other people and which are not directly connected with the defense and security of Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian people. So I don't expect any provocation or any escalation from the Ukrainian side. But in terms of political rhetoric, in terms of dealing with a bully, that's important to show that if you have your so-called red lines, Ukraine also has its own red lines, and it will reply to that. Of course, there are some, let's say, hawkish views among experts, that's not on the political level, but among experts in Ukraine, saying that we now need economic blockade of Russia, not only in terms of sanctions, which is obviously commonly and generally shared approach, but blockade of Russian seaports, because if Russia can afford blockade of Ukrainian seaport, then we have to retaliate like that. But there is this very delicate balancing act, again, between the threat of global food crisis, between the security and including the food security of many countries depending on Russian agricultural products and Ukrainian agricultural products, and then this desire to actually play by the same rules as Russia is doing. So I don't believe that this path of escalation, blockading Russia, etc., will be taken, just not to threaten the whole world. But on the other hand, sometimes it's really important to show Russia that we can push back and we will not be afraid to pay you actually in the same coin and then to react in the way that you are used to. Because unfortunately, the only language that Russia is obviously understands is the language of force, the language of strength, and not the language of compromises and the language of soft power, even if we want it, but that's not the case.
That is totally amazing insight by Yevgeniya Gaber. And before we go to the next part, and we'll talk about what will happen to Crimea and how decisive is the control over Crimea for the control over the Black Sea, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel to get informed about the new videos and new interviews on our channel, and know as the first one what else has happened in Ukraine and around Ukraine. But Yevgeniya, tell us what we are expecting since weeks and months is what will happen to Crimea. We have seen in the last weeks the next attack on the Kerch Bridge, the only connection between the Russian territory and occupied Crimea. And we see the further attempts of the Ukrainian army to hit the logistic lines, which are going on the northern coast of the Sea of Azov over the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by the Russians. Can we expect that Crimea can be cut by the Ukrainian army from the Russian logistics? And if, what will it mean for the situation on the Black Sea?
Well, first thing first, I think that it's important that the Ukrainian officials stress each and every time that there is no solution to this war without Crimea. The only option now on the table for not only Ukrainian officials, by the way, but also Ukrainian people is getting back to the territorial border, to the territorial integrity of Ukraine in its borders of 1991, including Crimea. All polls, all social researches show that Ukrainian people largely share, and when I say largely, it's 85, 87%, that of course Crimea has to be liberated within this counteroffensive with military tools, with diplomatic negotiations later at some point. It can be discussed, but then again, it's not about Crimea having any kind of special status, being left out of the brackets, and then we were just talking about mainland Ukraine. So this is one thing. And we just had Crimea platform meeting in Kiev. For those who do not know, there is a special mechanism, international forum for the occupation of Crimea, which has different dimensions, leaders dimensions, presidents, etc., parliamentary and expert network. So this expert network was just meeting the other day in Kiev, and I was there as well. And we were discussing different ways to deoccupy Crimea and what to do after this war, how to reintegrate Crimea, not only to deoccupy. And the general understanding was that without safe Crimea, there can be no safe and secure Black Sea region, because the importance of Crimea for control of the Black Sea region, but also of the Mediterranean for Russia, that's a huge one. So if we want to have a sustainable peace here, we need to deoccupy Crimea. Now, coming to the counteroffensive, obviously now it's the pace of the counteroffensive is lower than it was initially expected. Because of the heavily mined battlefield, because of the lack of air defense, which is a must for any counteroffensive. Ukraine needs air defense systems, F-16s. Without this, it's difficult to talk about any major breakthrough now. But what Ukrainian army is doing is trying, as you mentioned, absolutely to cut the logistical supply chains to Crimea, saying that probably if there might be a breakthrough towards Berdyansk or other cities in the area of the Azov Sea, it will be much easier to cut Crimea off new supplies and then to deoccupy it. Or at least if at some point they will be getting back to negotiations table with Russia, that will be from a position of strength, and the whole process of deoccupation might go in parallel with military deoccupation, but also negotiations to reintegrate Crimea back to Ukraine.
But what we see now with the Russian President Vladimir Putin openly encouraging the Russian civilians to make their vacation on Crimea, doesn't it look like that the Russians are trying to create some sort of human shield, like bringing artificially extra amount of civilians to Crimea?
Well, I think first there were interesting publications on how these flows of tourists actually block the military supplies and create problems for Russia because they are using the same routes, and because of the heavy traffic, it's now a bit more difficult to supply military equipment, etc. But I think there are two things here. One is mainly psychological one, and that's also PR for the Russian people, Russian Federation itself, showing that, as they say in Russian, "Всё идёт по плану," everything is going according to the plan. Because with these attacks on the Kerch Bridge, and then generally the situation, which is not favorable, let's say, for President Putin, it's important to shift attention and to show to the Russian people that as tourists, they can travel through the occupied territories of Ukraine and then get to Crimea and then to spend some time there. So there is this fuss around touristic season in Crimea. But on the other hand, there is interesting statistics showing the recent trends on the property market, and how people are actually trying to sell their apartments, their houses, their hotels, because still many Russians do not believe that everything is going according to the plan. So the prices were going low, at least that was in May, before the high season. And some Russians are still trying to leave the Crimean Peninsula because they understand that this is still an occupied territory, and it might not be really safe for them to stay there for the next month.
Well, if we come a bit back to the discussion of the military capacities on the Black Sea, and you have already mentioned that the Ukrainian army is in possession of naval drones, which have been used for attacks on the Russian facilities, harbors, and the Russian military vessels in high sea. But can we say now that Ukraine can attack any or most of the Russian vessels or can we say that that Russian vessels which have been transferred to the eastern part of the Black Sea, like Novorossiysk, or other harbors on the eastern part of the Black Sea, that they are more or less safe from the Ukrainian attacks and can be used as platforms for launching of the cruise missiles, like Caliber cruise missile?
Well, obviously, there was this a recent interview by Zaluzhny, who said that I'm not in a position to ask for permission to use my weapons, including long-range missiles, against
And Zaluzhny is the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, for our listeners who don't know it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. And the interview was in the Washington Post, so in case you want to check it, you can read it. So the main idea behind this interview was that I will do whatever I see necessary to deoccupy Ukraine, and even if these targets are somewhere, even on the Russian territory, there is a chance that we'll be using our weapons against it. On the other hand, we know the position of Ukraine's Western partners, who don't want to see their weapons being used against Russia on Russian territory, or at least in the way that would provoke major reaction again from the Russian side. So obviously what Ukraine is doing now is trying to stick to its weapon systems and arms systems that it has, indigenous ones, I mean Ukrainian ones, which create some problems because it limits the military capacity of Ukrainian army. So I don't think that Russian vessels can feel safe in any part of the Black Sea. But again, I think that there will be this desire to keep this balance in between a military necessity to attack targets and a possibility of a major escalation on sea. And whatever Ukraine is doing, it's not just a random attack. That's another important point. If you look at the Russian strategy, very often it's just a terror, a missile terror against Ukraine to intimidate people, to show that it can attack various places which have no interconnection and no strategy behind it. And what Ukraine is doing is a very well thought, well prepared, visionary counteroffensive. So just hitting any vessel, a ship in some part of the Black Sea, if it doesn't bring any additional value, let's say any added value to the counteroffensive, I don't see that happening, because still we value each and every ammunition that we have. But if this is a part of a bigger strategy of deoccupation of Crimea, Ukraine, or the Black Sea, I can say that this actually can happen, and this might happen, yeah.
Well, and that is an amazing insight which you have provided. And maybe my last question would be, what should we expect for the next months on the Black Sea? Because last year we have seen amazing naval operations of the Ukrainian army, the liberation of the Snake Island, and the destruction, like the hitting of the Russian flagship Moskva. Then we have not seen like any major successes on the sea. Can we say that the next chapter of the battle for the Black Sea will be written by the land forces of the Ukrainian army, or should we expect something which will happen on the sea?
I like this phrase by one of the Ukrainian ministers commenting on the comments of the British Minister of Defense, who said that, well, Western partners of Ukraine are not Amazon, which was a totally normal comment, because this was part of the general context. And we still know that Western partners support us, but sometimes there might be this frustration or comments from Western experts saying that Ukraine has everything it needs for deoccupation. Ukraine has a lot of Western systems. Ukrainians have motivation, so you can go and deoccupy. It's difficult to deoccupy your territory only having motivation and not having air support, for example. So the comment or quote which I mentioned was, if our Western partners are not Amazon, that Ukraine is not Netflix. And that's not about problems in the relations of Ukraine with its Western partners, but it's rather a joke showing that one cannot expect these breakthroughs, Hollywood-style sea battles with what Ukraine has now. If we are realistic, we have to understand that we're dealing with major multiple problems on different directions at the same time, starting from floating mines to mined battlefield on land. So it's really difficult for me, not being a military expert, to say how exactly this process will happen. But what I can say, it will unlikely be the way like Kherson, Kharkiv, or Kiev deoccupation happened in a couple of days. Obviously, that will take time because the longer this war is extended in time, and the more of a protracted conflict we have, the more difficult it becomes for Ukraine to deoccupy its territories. I believe there will be an amphibious combined operation, both on land and on sea, in the coming months, but I don't expect it to happen really fast. And I don't expect it to happen before at least late autumn this year. So there is still time to proceed step by step with incremental progress and advances on the front line, first on land and then probably on sea.
Well, there is still time for us to wait, and the most important thing, we may not expect from Ukraine to be some sort of weird entertainment like Netflix. It's not about achieving stunning results. It's about saving life and about liberating the country. It's about death and life. It's about blood and suffering. And we all, of course, wish Ukraine all the best on the way to liberation of its territory, but we may never push the Ukrainians to do what they cannot and what we just expect from them to do, because it's their war and it's Ukrainian lives and Ukrainian territory. Thank you, Yevgeniya Gaber, Senior Fellow of Atlantic Council, who is a resident of Odesa, who spent with us her time today and described the situation on the Black Sea and around the Black Sea. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, to share this video. Don't forget to comment it. Thank you, Yevgeniya, for your stunning interview, and see you next time.
Thank you, Sergey. See you. Thank you.